So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So this is kind of a summary of the research that I've been doing. Really, this started back in 2011. And the story goes a lot further back than that. It's the basic value of the field is it's computational papyrology. So papyri are the manuscripts made of reeds that were used commonly throughout the ancient world. Romans, Greeks, Egyptians, everybody that you see scrolls are basically using papyri. So what we're going to talk about today is understanding data science and how it applies to understanding ancient manuscripts. So to talk about this, I first want to just mention collaborators past, and then I'll talk about collaborators present. So people that have been involved in this project over the years include Matthew Wang, who's a graduate of the program, Hiram Carroll, who is a faculty here. A couple of my GMU students worked a little bit on the Galaxy part of it. Leo Shamir worked on the Galaxy Zoo part, and then a group of people from Oxford University, a group of people from University of Minnesota, and other collaborators as well. Currently, the people that are working on this are really located in 3 different locations. There's a University of Kentucky group, James and Ben. James is the papyrologist on the project right now. So he's the person that is an expert in understanding ancient Greek manuscripts. His primary research is looking at some of the charred manuscripts from Herculaneum, so basically scanning and interpreting those manuscripts. Ben is an undergraduate student who's working with him. Alex Williams was a master's student and undergraduate student here. He worked with me while he was here on this project on his master's thesis. He is a faculty member at University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and he's also currently on leave with Amazon. And I'm not sure if he'll be going back or not, but that's, he's certainly looking at the different options. Greg, Chase, and Timothy are all students on the project. At MTSU, the primary student and the person doing the heavy lifting has been Matthew Swindle. Graham West has also been working on this the last few weeks, especially in some of the entropic issues. So the basic plan for today is I'm going to talk about classification of manuscripts and identifying manuscripts, or classification of images and identifying manuscripts, dealing with crowdsourced data, the idea of collection and data reduction. I'm going to spend some time about how that's done. I want to talk about neural networks and training with crowdsourced data and the issues associated with that. The big thing I want to get to is ambiguity in data sets and how ways of approaching that and understanding how we can approach that and deal with that, and also automatic identification of manuscripts. So to kind of put this in a bigger context of how things work, there's really like 3 modes of computing that we talk about. There's numerical computing, which is the standard thing of writing a program and Fortran or Python. You're doing numerical processing. It's extremely faster than humans, and computers are just hugely better at numerical processing than humans are. The next thing is computational intelligence, which relies on taking human data and training it. And the idea of training data and getting issues are basically doing that. Well, you have to have a good training set to start with. The algorithms are somewhat primitive, and they're usually not as good as humans for most tasks, right? So humans are still the winners at pattern recognition and classification. The human computing is the third model, and this is the idea of crowdsourcing or citizen science. Basically, we are wired for pattern recognition. We're terrible at numerical processing. We couldn't possibly keep up to a computer doing numerical work. But if you look at things, we detect the patterns better than most people. And the place where this shines is this problem, basically. It's right here, which is these are equivalent to humans, right? There's a picture of cats, and there's a picture of a cat. To humans, we immediately recognize those are the same thing. They both have the funny ears, they have little whiskers and nose, but training a computer to recognize that image as a cat is considerably harder than training humans, or at least they're not as good at it. And they've gotten a lot better. They've gotten hugely better in the last 5 years, but it still continues to be a challenge. This project picks up basically in about 2010 or so, when we started looking at galaxies. And these are examples of different types of galaxies. These things up here are elliptical galaxies. These are spiral galaxies. And these are things that don't fit into either category. They're irregular or peculiar galaxies. And I could spend maybe half an hour and you would actually be able to recognize these very easily. But the trouble is that, getting a computer to recognize them is difficult. And there's a lot of ambiguous examples. So in about 2007, there was this giant sample of these galaxies that had to be classified. And when you have, in this case, 1 million galaxies that have to be classified, you need a strategy of how you're going to approach this kind of data problem. And the approach that they picked was Kevin. This is Kevin. This is Kevin Schwanzig. He was a graduate student at Oxford. He actually has moved on to other jobs now. But he was given the task of hand classifying 1 million galaxies for his dissertation. So he's supposed to look at 1 million images, go through them one by one, determine if they're spiral, elliptical, or whatever. And he basically went through 50,000 of them in about 2 weeks and said, I have enough for my sample and for my research, I'm done. So what he did at this point was put everything online. And he put it online with this interface called Galaxy Zoo. And Galaxy Zoo was very simple. It was like, is a clockwise spiral, basic things as an elliptical galaxy. The basic interface was extremely simple. And what this allowed them to do was to go through huge amounts of data extremely rapidly. They went through the 1 million images, in a matter of days. They basically went through the entire data set in days, and they managed eventually to get 40 classifications per galaxy. Now, when you have 40 classifications per galaxy, you can apply statistical methods to understand what things are working and what things are not. So the thing that happened after this was we started looking at other things that we could use crowdsourcing for. 130,000 scientists, 1 million galaxies classified, 40 million clicks, and you can really do a lot with this kind of data set. The thing that comes out immediately is this, that there are things that are more ambiguous than others. So there are some galaxies that are more spirally than other galaxies. So this is a very clear spiral galaxy. You can see the arms are obvious in it. And this one, not as much. You can't tell the direction of it as easily, not as clear to see what's going on. Here's 2 galaxies that are classified as ellipticals. In this case, 90% of the people that looked at it said that's an elliptical galaxy. In this case, only 50% said it's an elliptical galaxy. And there's some cues in this that make it a little harder, and I don't want to get into the details of this. The color is a little bluish. It looks like it could be an edge-on spiral. There's cases in image classification that are just more ambiguous than others. And that's kind of a reoccurring theme of crowdsourcing, is that we think that there are these distinct classes, but the reality is there really aren't. There's a lot of things that are just ambiguous and difficult to understand. So, this was great. It was great for doing citizen science, but the problem we get to is that it doesn't work for everything. So, but maybe we can apply other types of models. So that brings us up to this idea of classifying ancient Greek manuscripts. And back in the 1920s, these 2 archaeologists, Grenfell and Hutt, went to Egypt, and they went to this city in kind of south of Cairo called Oxyrhynchus, and were doing archaeological digs. They came up with 600 crates filled with manuscripts that were like this. So in these manuscripts, they were buried in the desert from in the period of 300 to about 800 AD. They're written in Greek, even though it's Egypt, and they have everything in them, everything from Gospels to, this is a little bit of Euclid's geometry. So from mathematics to philosophy to fiction, they're all in there. There's also contracts, there's insurance things, everything is buried in this set. And in that time period, when they brought this stuff back to Oxford in 1920, they want to go through this and find out what discoveries there were from the ancient world. Well, the trouble is, in the time period since then, since 1920, 100 years, only about 10% of the manuscripts have been looked at, and a lot fewer than that has actually been published. So a lot of the stuff is basically still sitting in the crates that were dug up, or that were filled after they dug these up in ancient Egypt. But the Ancient Lives Project kind of set out to address this. So this is just a fragment of a papyri. We call these fragments. And again, this is ancient reeds that have been kind of knotted together to put this all in a coherent thing. And what we're trying to do is transcribe this and identify the manuscript. Now, you can see there's problems associated with this. First of all, some of the characters are pretty worn down. You can't see them very well. There's also giant rips in the manuscript, and there's huge sections of it that are missing. And this is one of the better and clearer examples of this manuscript. So, so the Ancient Lives Project kind of set out to address this by doing crowdsourcing again. I want to show you like the problem of identifying something like this by showing you an English example of a papyri fragment. So what I did is I took a familiar English poem, and 94% of the characters are transcribed correctly. So there's only a 6% error rate, but 30% of them are missing. The other thing you have to know, though, is ancient Greek manuscripts do not have any spaces between the words. So let me show you the manuscript, and let's take a look at this and see if you can identify it. If you identify, type in the chat room, or you can just unmute your microphone. That's fine too. Yeah, Lewis Carroll. Bill Robertson wins a prize. So let me just put this together. And this is taking the spaces out and fixing it. So this is Jabberwocky. So this is what it actually looks like when we read it. So the ancient Greeks didn't have spaces. They just read this as a series of phonetic sounds that were broken into the words in their brain, but they didn't have the spacing. So this is equal to this. So even if you were an expert in English poetry and you saw this, it would take a while for you to identify what this is. And the character transcriptions and all the issues associated with it make it harder. So again, that brings us up to this Ancient Lives project. The idea of Ancient Lives is to take the Oxyrhynchus documents and put it together in a coherent pattern by using crowdsourcing. The interface that we had for this project was this, that we had basically this little Greek keyboard, and you'd click on the letters and you'd literally just type in the different characters on top of that. So you did not need to read ancient Greek to do this. All you had to do is be able to recognize the patterns on the keyboard and how those are associated with the patterns on the manuscript. So non-experts could do this really well. So the technologies behind this is we use basically Amazon cloud computing, so that when there was a lot of demand that would scale up to this. We use the Xeniverse infrastructure, which is a server-side stuff that was really nice for making everything work. And initially we used a standard JSON. Actually, we used an SQL database initially, then a JSON database, and a further improvement. So the data that we got out was basically the transcriptions associated with this manuscript. And I want to show you kind of how this works. So this is kind of a typical manuscript that you'd have, a whole bunch of letters here. This actually adds a little bit of spacing here because it's more of a document instead of a literature. But this is clearly like the top of the document, and you can see something about it to get clues about what it is. But again, there's huge problems. There's all capital letters with no spaces. They're usually a smaller fragment from a larger thing. There's margins, there's all these ambiguities in the data that we have to deal with. Multiple columns, handwriting slopes changes, literally no punctuation. So when you put this together, this is what a transcription actually looks like. So I'm going to just play this. So what I'm going to do is play all the people that clicked on this and what they picked for the letters. So this is at super high speed compared to how long it actually took. But you saw one user just did a few characters. Now this person's systematically working his way through the manuscript, kind of trying to identify every character he can. Then you see another user coming in, starting at the top and going on top of that. So the users aren't clicking exactly in the same location. You see that there's a little bit of ambiguity about where they're doing this, but they're basically allowing them to click on the manuscript. And when you look at everything, you can see that characters are clustering into different things. However, this one person decided, I'm going to just click above the characters and label everything up there. So some people did this a little bit different than everybody else. So this is the kind of thing that we're getting out of it, is this kind of thing that looks like it's a pretty good consensus. And this is a nice diagram, but the data that comes out of it looks like this. The raw data that comes out of the Ancient Lives project has basically 5 fields. Number one, we have a user ID. The user ID in this case is 200. So this is user number 200, whoever that is. And you can see all the clicks that they did. The next thing is a fragment ID, which is basically like an image ID that they're looking at. And on that image, there's X and Y coordinates of the position. And then this would be it's the English equivalent of the Greek letter that they're doing. So this would be like a rho, and this is Omicron. Yes, sorry, shouldn't bring up Omicron in the talk, but anyway, it's all good. So, so the consensus algorithm is the first part of this. So each fragment, the idea of this was a simple thing. We find on a given fragment, we find out the user who had the most clicks. We use those clicks kind of as seeds for the characters. We assume that they kind of got it right. And we take the next user with the next most clicks and add them, and then try to update the physical locations. If there is an alignment, and that's defined being within a certain range of being close together, then you just update the character position. And if they don't align, then it's probably a new character, and you add that to the set of known characters. And then you tally the data to find out which characters are identified. So you go from basically individual users doing this to this idea of a consensus. And the consensus is the following things. This is, again, for a single fragment. This is an X position and Y position of the character. And this is the characters that were found. So there's 29 people clicked on this character. 24 of those people said it's an iota. 2 people said it was a tau. 2 people didn't know. And 1 person left it blank, right? In this case, this is kappa. 26 people said it's a kappa out of 27 people. 1 person didn't bother identifying it. Some of the characters are obviously more ambiguous than others. Even in this sample here, you look at this, and this pi here, 7 people said a pi, 3 people didn't know. So it must have been harder because a lot of people ignored it. But it's still a pretty good consensus in this case. 11 and 4, you can see the breakdown depends on the particular character. So the result of this is, a pretty good guess about most of the characters. There's going to be some errors in this, but most of the characters are probably going to be aligned. Some stuff just wasn't transcribed. This line down here, for whatever reason, nobody did. Again, not clear why. Some of the characters over here that are a little ambiguous are missed as well. The next thing is formation of lines of text, which we calculate the statistics of spacing. We try to start with the characters in the upper left. We systematically go through it, and I'm not going to go into all the details of this. But the idea is we can sort of turn this into lines of text, and we can approximate the amount of spaces that there are. And that allows us to get something that looks like this, which kind of looks like the original manuscript. So this is the 2 things next to each other. Again, this is the papyri. This is our transcription of the papyri. It's relatively accurate. Some of the last characters may or may not be good, but it's relatively accurate in terms of what we're doing. So we have a pretty good transcription of different things going on. And the net result of this is that the accuracy we're getting compared to is about 85% of the professional transcriptions. We get the accurate positions mapped in the image, but the thing we're left to is how we do the other 600 crates of manuscripts, right? So we've barely touched the surface using the manuscripts we have. We only have probably about a few thousand manuscripts that we're doing, and there's literally hundreds of thousands yet to do. We can't just ask for volunteer help to do all of it, because it'll still take us decades and decades if we wanted to do that. So the next thing is using automatic character recognition. So as you all know, like automatic character recognition, OCR, is really good. This is a handwritten example of OCR. And this is a standard training set. It's about 50,000 numbers, distributed 1 through 9. And when you just train this with simple neural networks, you get pretty good results. For our manuscripts, it's going to be a little bit harder. And there's a lot of things that are harder about it. Number one, this is a pretty free-form document, right? So understanding where things are in the document, which things are character and which things are not, is a lot harder than you would think. Second of all, image quality is going to be different between different manuscripts. So some things are going to be different than others. Handwriting styles vary, the image quality and contrast vary. So it's going to be a harder thing to do. But we decided to take this on basically in the last year. And the process that was done, and this was Matthew Swindle's work for his qualifying exam and also for a paper that he led, was to, we kind of collected the annotations and calculated the consensus. Then we do this cropping of letters. We take the letters from the manuscript, and instead of having the whole papyri, we're cropping them down to smaller areas that are kind of bounding boxes around the letters. We made two data sets that are available, an AL all and AL public. The AL all is about 400,000 characters. AL public is about half that. And the reason we have to care about the public versus the all stuff is that there are copyright issues with these manuscripts. They're owned by the Egyptian Exploration Society, which means that we can't display certain manuscripts without their permission. And we wanted to set up a big database and make it available. The next thing we did is we ran this through basically 4 different types of neural networks to understand how classification works and how well we can classify. So that's the basic idea, is that we're kind of taking this and building it. So this is kind of what these character clips look like. This is the Greek alphabet with different sets, and kind of examples of some of the characters that we have. And just showing some of the character differences, and we're going to come back to this in a bit, but you can see alpha has about 42,000 examples of alpha in our 400,000 characters. So this is a really commonly used character. Beta is less common. Beta is only 2,500 characters. And if you go down to sigma, the letter sigma, we only have 62 examples of a traditional sigma in our database. So this is a highly unbalanced data set. Some of the characters are well represented, other ones are not. So just to talk about the 4 different neural nets that we're going to look at, is we looked at Tesseract, which is a standard OCR piece of software. This is probably the standard software for doing OCR right now, and it's used widely for doing for transcription of books. It's been around for a long time. It's been improved in a lot of different ways. So we wanted to try that first. We want to just see how Tesseract worked. Then we used just a very base CNN, which is a simple 4-layer CNN. We used CNNXG, which is a CNN with a decision tree added on top of it. And then we used ResNet, which is a deep learning network. So Tesseract is the first thing. And again, this is Matthew's work, so credit where credit's due. This is the correct predictions that we got. So looking at this set of 400,000 characters, we only got 45,000 of the characters right after they were trained. And we had big fails on 33% of them. So this is not just incorrect prediction, it's just a fail. It doesn't know what to do. So this is hugely terrible, right? So we're not getting basically anywhere using the standard software. And the reason is the standard software uses the fact that we're doing mostly high contrast, easy to read characters. When you look at all of our images, it has this kind of brown mottled background. You can see this is the fragments or the different fibers in the papyri itself. And it's much more difficult to read things with this kind of background, especially if there's tears and holes and all these other things. When you pick up a book by Jane Austen, even if it was published in the 1800s, the contrast is good, the characters are clear, it was typeset, it was easy to do. So OCR starts failing under those circumstances. The next network was one that Matthew Swindle came up with, which is just basically a 4-level pooling and flattening. So it's using ReLU activation and a softmax output layer. And this was the simple version of a network, so simple version of an image classification system. The CNN is convolution neural networks. Making these networks is relatively simple in using Keras and TensorFlow. We use Keras, I think, for all of our experiments. The next one was CNNXG. Again, I used the XG boost decision tree to add on top of this. So it's similar to the first parts of the layers, but we're adding a different layer down here. And then finally, ResNet. So ResNet is not something that we created on our own. This is, again, a standard system that's used for image classification. It's been around for 4 or 5 years, I guess. And the thing that's different about it is it has convolution layers, it does normalization, there's convolution layers, and this repeats itself 16 times. So the network has over 150 layers in it. So this is again, this is a deep network. And it has lots of dropout layers. It has a softmax activation. So the bottom part and the top part are the same. It's just that in the center part, there's a lot more layers, which allow a lot more parameters for training. Just because you're adding 16 times layers doesn't mean you have that many free parameters. It actually, the number of free parameters is more like a few thousand within this. It's not over the top crazy. So it does end up working well. So the first thing is just looking at the base results of this. So we've already talked about the fact that Tesseract isn't working very well. This is just the base accuracy when we first take this. So just taking this off the shelf, plugging it in, and looking at the base accuracy, the CNN base does like pretty well for validation. It does about 87%. The XB boosts a little bit, and ResNet's about 80%, which is a little surprising. But the thing that we wanted to do after this was to explore this and to see if we could actually improve the parameters by changing the tuning. So if you notice in the thing here, the activation function is listed, but the tree depth is listed. The number of pooling kernels is listed. The learning rate can be changed. So by adjusting the different parameters in the neural net, you can get better levels of convergence. And still looking at Matthew's work here. So this is just showing the differences between modeling accuracy and loss between the different layers. So accuracy and loss graphs are commonly used. The validation accuracy, the accuracy keeps going up. The validation accuracy for ResNet stalls out if you're just using, again, a single training. But things get a lot better when you start doing a couple of these tricks. First of all, the idea of hypertuning, the idea of just using a grid search with all the parameters. And second of all, instead of using just one set of data for training, using k-fold cross-validation. In other words, what you train for a while and you separate some fraction of this 10 or 20% out as test data. So you train with the data, then you use the other data as test data, and you keep randomly switching what is your test and training data. That helps the training a lot because you're not just getting stuck on the same images, you're forcing the network to adapt that your training set is varying each time. And you can see with the CNN base, it doesn't get much better. It stalls just below 80%. This is overfitting going on here. This is not a good thing. This looks like it's great, but it's definitely not. With ResNet, things are looking pretty good. And the final results of this is that we're getting sort of 90, upper 80% or low 90% accuracy with ResNet. The CNN base and CNN boosted are not really improving with any of these things. They're, okay, they're getting it to 90%, but ResNet's just definitely cleaning up in terms of its accuracy. So one of the lessons here is that, first of all, we're able to predict the characters fairly accurately with a very simple network, with only a 4-layer network. But to get the accuracy up to around 90%, we have to do additional layers of this and use something a little bit more complicated, which is, of course, why that network was designed. It was designed exactly for image recognition. I just want to mention a couple things. So first of all, this data is available for use. If you want to play with it, it's out there. We have a web server for the program, which is data.cs@mtsu.edu. If you go to that website, you can download the data set, the public data set, which is 200,000 characters, and play with it yourself. The other thing I just want to do is just an internal promotion on this. If you have a data set that you want to make available to other people, this is a public-facing website. So if you have a data site that you want to archive and make available because you're publishing a paper, this is a good place to put it because we can archive it and have it there forever. And it's also a nice, easy URL, data.cs@mtsu.edu. So this is just kind of the archiving site we had to set up because of the paper we were publishing. So far, what we have is this idea. Let me mention another website, which is Thea, which is the next thing. So the net result of this was taking the ResNet and the Tesseract and CNN, and we have a little website that was put up at UTK. That's actually at GitHub that was put up by UTK scientists. I think this was done by Gregory. He made it so you can just literally upload a character snippet and have it classify it. So it's basically like an on-demand transcription site. You can upload 70 by 70 images, color images, and it will try to figure out which Greek character it is. If you upload, a picture of a cat, it will not figure out it's a cat. It'll probably try to identify it, and it will probably have an ambiguity with that as well. But the thing I want to transition into is this idea of image ambiguity. So if you notice on ResNet, when it looks at this image is a lambda, and it's 99.998% confident it's a lambda. But it said, maybe that could be an alpha, right? Could be an alpha. The CNN said that's an iota, so it got it wrong, but it's still very confident it got it wrong. And Tesseract didn't have any idea what it was. So the thing we got to was trying to understand, how does confidence and misclassification tie together? The first thing that we wanted to do was to look at images that were classified in 3 different bins. One is over 66% confident. In other words, the network's returning that it is at least 66% confident that the characters it's classifying are right. And you can see kind of some of the characters in here. This is, that's pretty clearly a delta. Omicron, not sure if that's actually an Omicron. This is a delta again. But it's getting most of these characters right. It's very confident that even though this is hard to see that that's a phi, it's very confident this is a delta. This is 99% confidence. Some of the things like the Omicron here, it's 76% confident. Again, not sure that's right. But still, this is the best set, right? So most of the characters fall into this category. This is kind of a middle category where we have 33 to 66% confidence. So the neural network is coming up with confidences that are high. So this is, again, that looks like a lambda, even though it's only 44% confident, looks like a lambda. Probably that's a pi. That might be an iota, but there's something wrong with the image. This thing is pretty blurry. It's very hard to see what it is, but the confidence kind of is in a middle range, so I can see why it had trouble with that. I certainly don't see a nu in that image, so, and that doesn't look like a nu either. The least confident images are over here on this left side. And the thing you're seeing here is these do not look like Greek characters, right? They're not at all as clear as some of the stuff over here. But the network is still trying to classify this, right? They're still come up with an answer. Well, about 18% confident, that's a pi. So it's not doing a great job with it, but it is at least attempting to classify it. When we looked at this in more detail, the thing that we find is that if you look at the ResNet confidence, which is between 0 and 100%, it would be 100% if it only picks one thing, is that our low confidence images tend to be more blurry. So this is a variance of the Laplacian, just kind of a method of blurriness to try and understand this. So definitely blurry images seem like they're more likely that, or blurry images are down here. This is the blurry images are up here. So these images on higher confidence tend to be less blurry. Not 100%, obviously there's still some down here, but all the images that are low ResNet confidence tend to be blurry. So this is obviously a problem, like the blurriness that we're seeing as an issue. The other thing that we're seeing as an issue is that the classes are highly unbalanced, which is something I mentioned before. Alpha versus sigma, huge differences in the class sizes. And then we get to the other thing, which is, like, why are we misclassifying characters? Well, blurriness, confidence, and how do we fix this? How do we make our accuracy even higher? And there's a couple parts to this that are interesting. One is not only how do we get better at it, but the thing that would be great is if we knew we were doing a bad job on a character, sending that to an expert and saying, okay, what is this, would be great. So we want to know when we're likely to be wrong, and if the network's telling us are likely to be wrong. So the combination of things we want to do is to not only improve the training accuracy, but also understand what's ambiguous. I want to mention, when you look at these characters, you notice these don't look like they are Greek characters at all. So a lot of these are probably errors associated with either the algorithm, in other words, our clipping size is wrong, or the consensus, where we're picking a position where some data didn't align with the others and it's leading us astray. Or it might be that the consensus character is just wrong. So this being a theta is not correct, but that could be because it was identified as a theta by just a few more humans than it was. The thing to understand that I think is really critical is that consensus data from crowdsourced data doesn't have an unambiguous identification. A lot of the characters have the ambiguity associated with the fact that several people looked at them. Some people are better than others, and the algorithms that are combining them aren't perfect either. So there's a lot of issues about understanding what is the actual character. We treat the training data and the testing data as though it's right. And it probably, in many cases, is not. At least 10 or 20% could be just problematically just wrong in terms of identification or the clip size or the consensus or whatever. So understanding how that works is going to be the thing we're going to talk about next. So to understand the issue with this and understanding classification, it's useful to make a couple definitions. The first thing is the idea of Shannon entropy. And the idea of Shannon entropy is when you have a probability distribution across characters like this, so all these probabilities add up to 1, you can take the probability times the log of the probability and calculate the entropy. And it's the summation over all the classes. This is just doing just an example of 10 different classes, A through J. In this case, all the probabilities in one bin. We have a probability of 1 here. We have a log of probability. And basically, when you do this, that sure doesn't look like log of 1 should be 0. Anyway, I'm just going to move on from that. But yeah, the entropy changes as you have a more ambiguous system, and when you have a completely uniform system, it goes basically to the log of the number, log of the even probability distribution. So there's this kind of range of things that you're going to be doing. So we can use this in two different ways. That first of all, we can use this in understanding the machine learning part of this, the neural network part of this, by thinking about how we're going to construct a loss function. So in any of the neural networks that we're doing, the idea of the neural network is that you have a bunch of free coefficients, and what you're trying to do is to minimize the error between what you're predicting and what you actually have. So you have your true value and you have your target values. So the true value is the value that is actually in the data set. The target value is what you're predicting. Now, the simple way of doing this is to say that, well, okay, the true value in this thing is the consensus value, which is, let's say an alpha. So it's an alpha because 17 out of 18 people said it's an alpha. And then when we look at the output of the neural network, the output of the neural network has a set of probabilities as well. And those set of probabilities basically are saying that, well, the most likely thing at the 99.8% level is that it's an alpha, or maybe it's at the 70% level. But we can just look at those two things and look at the peak of the probability distribution and use those as the truth. And when we do that, that's called binary cross categorical entropy or binary cross entropy. We calculate the loss based on the primary identification of the true values and the target values. So it's only using the peak probability for both the sets. Another option is to compare the probability distributions of the true versus target values. So instead of just looking at the peak value, we can look at the distribution of the human probabilities across all the possible things for that character. So again, we're looking at one image, and we're saying, well, okay, like 15 out of 17 people said an alpha, but 2 people said it's a beta. So we're going to use the fact that beta was included as well and calculate that together. So the KLD thing is basically going to look at that, but it's also going to look at the probability distribution from the neural network. So it's kind of like calculating cross entropy. It uses a slightly different formula, but it uses a probability distribution for both sets to find out how good your match is. Okay, and the next part that helps us understand this is a data set that was created by Matthew, which is called the good batch and the bad batch. So the good batch is basically the idea that it's where the ResNet and the CNN and the human classifications all agree. So it's where everybody's happy, where ResNet says that's an alpha and humans say that's an alpha, and everybody agrees that's an alpha. So these are pretty clear examples of alpha. And then there's the bad batch. The bad batch is where humans say that's an alpha, and both ResNet and our CNN says that's not an alpha. So this is some examples of this. And when you look at this, these seem like they could potentially be alphas, but that could also be, you know, a lowercase omega. It could be other things that are going on here. And it's a little ambiguous to understand it. Certainly some of them are just blurry. But what we did is we created a data set with 18,000 characters in each set. So that allows us to do some testing to try and understand what's the difference between correctly classified data and incorrectly classified data. So one of the things we wanted to do was just looking at the KLD between the good batch and the bad batch. So what we're going to do is take the good batch and then classify it again, and looking at the cross-categorical, well, basically we're doing the similarity between the entropy in the two different sets. In the characters that are good, and all the characters that are good, this is basically our entropy distribution. And I should stop. This is really not KLD. This is really just the distribution of entropy for the characters. In our good data set, the entropy is, you know, very much skewed towards low entropy. This means that basically all the power is in one category, and there's a few things that are classified correctly that are not in one category. In the bad data set, it's quite the opposite. Basically, all the characters that are bad, or almost all the characters that are bad, have, you know, most of their entropy spread across a wider variety of things. So the entropy is spread across a lot more classes, are not skewed down here. In other words, the things that are in the good batch tend to have lower entropy. The things in the bad batch have a wider distribution of entropy. That doesn't tell us exactly what's going on, but it does say something that the neural net's having more trouble classifying things that are in the bad batch. The thing we tried next was, and this is extremely preliminary, this is Graham and Matthew working on this. The idea is that we're trying to look at the probability, the KLD probability for the machine versus the KLD probability for the human. So we're training the network in a different way at this case. We're basically using the fact that we can use the entire set of probabilities for training, and we find a really nice distribution for the KLD probabilities on this. So we're getting a nice correlation between the two, suggesting this might be a better way of training than just using cross-category thing. But again, we're in really preliminary stages with this. In the bad batch, there's something odd going on here, and the reason this is odd is that if the probability is over 50% on the machine, that means that it would have been classified as the same character. The stuff up here would be things that were classified correctly. So the thing up here is things that are classified correctly. So in this case, everything is classified correctly, but nothing can be classified correctly, or the machine and the humans can't agree. So there's a gap in this particular data. So approaching the way that we're doing this, the training, by changing our metric or changing our loss function, is one of the things that we're exploring. The other thing that we're exploring is this idea of how do we fix an unbalanced data set. So you've probably all seen this. These are people that don't exist. There's a website called This Person Does Not Exist, which generates fake people. And what it's doing is it's taking images from a whole bunch of different human images, and it's blending them together in making people that don't actually exist. Most of the results are pretty amazingly good. Occasionally, you notice things like the earrings are mismatched, or the eye colors are wrong, or whatever. But it's using regenerative neural networks to do this. So the question is, could we augment our data set using regenerative neural networks? And the answer is yes. So these are characters that don't exist. So all of these characters are Greek characters that don't actually exist in our data set. Z and psi both don't exist in our data set in very good numbers. They're really underrepresented. So we're trying to generate new things and then putting them in the data set to augment our data set and kind of balance it out a little bit better to see if that improves what we're doing. And the preliminary results of this are looking promising. So, effectively what we're doing is we're synthetically generating data, and we're training our neural nets on our existing data plus the synthetic data. And we're still having problems. We're still not getting extremely high successes. But when we're adding the synthetic data, we're moving from like 76% recognition of Z to 92% recognition. So it's definitely improving it. Although I think we still have some experiments we need to do this. The other thing that's interesting is that training humans to recognize ancient Greek characters is hard because there's not a lot of examples of psi. So we're trying to also think about this in terms of a teaching tool for people that are learning papyrology. So I want to talk a little bit about a final step of this project. So in terms of all the neural networks and the training, we're making good progress on this. We still have a lot of understanding a lot of work to do to understand this deeper thing about how we train, how we recognize ambiguity, and how we deal with these particularly ambiguous and difficult data sets. The biggest issue is that crowdsourced data occasionally just goes wrong. And how do we recognize that in the crowdsourced data? And how do we go back and redo this? We're looking at other strategies, including reweighting the data based on the users, how accurately the user agrees with the consensus or agrees with the machine. But ultimately, it gets down to what do you trust as the truth of what a character is? There's no key that tells us what the actual result is for 400,000 characters. James, our papyrologist in the project, has refused to actually hand classify every single image. So I don't blame him for that, but it would be really handy if we could actually have somebody do that. The next thing is that I want to talk about, and really the final thing, is this idea of character classification, so or manuscript identification. So when you start looking at a manuscript like this thing, which is obviously Jabberwocky, how do you know if this is the real thing? So just imagine you only have a few characters here and you're trying to identify it with a text. Well, this is the original text down here. What you could use is something from bioinformatics. And the idea is that there's a relationship between characters on this and amino acids. And you wouldn't think there is, but there is, because there's 24 amino acids that are used, and in genetic sequences, there's a thing called BLAST, which basically is a basic local alignment search tool developed by the National Center for Bioinformatics Technology. And the idea is this, that when you have a certain DNA sequence or amino acid sequence from DNA, this is amino acid sequence, this is what a snow leopard looks like, this is what tiger looks like, but all of them have very similar sequences. So aligning them by a bioinformatics sequence can work really nicely. So this is a real actual alignment using BLAST, using an example of it. But what we can do in the computational papyrology is basically code our letters as amino acids. So there's 24 amino acids, 24 Greek characters. It's magical. We can just code them. And we can actually use BLAST to do fragment identification by saying this is the fragment, this is the text, here's the similar characters. So this is just an example, and the random chance of this happening is like 10 to the minus 18th. So extremely likely to do that they're the same. It happens to be a little fragment from Commentary on a Gospel, I think. So this whole process of applying computational tools to the ancient world is a really interesting journey for me, because I am definitely not an expert in ancient Greek manuscripts. But I know a whole bunch of different techniques in computational and data science that can be applied to these to move us forward and try to move us to the next level in understanding how we can do this kind of work. And we have a lot of work still to do. Aside from understanding ambiguity in our classifications, the other thing that we have to do is really going back to the original manuscripts and figuring out how we go from this to kind of partitioning the images and picking out the characters automatically. That is a thing we're working on. We're looking at a bunch of different approaches to this, from autocorrelation to using something called YOLO, which is basically an auto partitioning algorithm that you train like anything else. Again, initial work looks really promising, but we have so much work to do. But it's all leading to really interesting things. Our group, I think, is probably one of the leading groups in this in the world, because we have better computational resources and access to some of the best data. The Oxyrhynchus collection is clearly one of the best collections for doing this with, but we also have really excellent computational expertise here at UTK and also University of Kentucky now. So I'm going to end there, and I'm going to make sure that everybody can unmute. So if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
I suppose I have a question.
Yes, Matthew.
When you were creating the synthetic data for characters, you were able to use the same code as these are not people? Like, did they have open source code?
Yeah, I think Matthew, you can answer that better. That's correct, right? I mean,
yes. Yeah. If you go to the This Person Does Not Exist website, it takes a little second for it to load, but on the right, you'll see they have three options. I think there's a simple option, and it's basically just a command line. You do a simple pip install in your environment, and there's a lot of different options you can include: attention, GPU training. It's a lot of different things, and it pretty much spells it all out for you.
Wow, that's really cool.
Yeah.
It's shockingly realistic characters. We actually have, on Matthew's next paper, we have some expert papyrologists looking at it to see if they can understand which ones are real and which ones are not.
Mm-hmm.
See, I wonder, did you ever do, I mean, when they do things for entropy, things for English language type stuff, they start to do letter pairs, letter through. Yeah. I mean, the blast stuff is starting to do that sort of thing, right? You're looking for the pattern in there, because, you know, that's what struck me going through, is that if you start to now look at the characters in pairs, there are certain pairs that, you know, in English, there's certain character sequences that are very, very rare. And so that would help guide you maybe to identify one that's.
Absolutely. Yeah, so BLAST does that all in the background. It actually is using multi-character pairs. It's looking at separation distances. And what it's doing is it's doing, you know, runs of 2, 3, 4, and 5, I think, and then actually doing alignment with those. So it is, and, you know, with our data, the trouble that we get to is that we don't exactly know if there's 2 spaces or 3 spaces there, but we don't have to write the software, because bioinformaticists, yes, that's the real word, have exactly the same problem, right? So even though we don't have perfect alignment, we can estimate roughly what it is and know that there's a gap, and because of that, the software can just kind of take advantage of that.
I need to get a copy of that slide with the poem, because I got it right. And Sharon, my wife, and I have a competition every day with Wordle to see who can get the Wordle. We do the New York Times mini crossword and the so word stuff. You know, if I bet I got that faster than I think she would, although I could be wrong.
That's because, well, Bill, and I say this with all due respect, as a colleague, you're a geek, and Jabberwocky is a geek poem. Other questions?
Yeah, Dr. Wallin?
Yes.
So how do you want us to come in?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
David. Yeah.
How are you saying you need additional people that have interest in working on these things?
So, I mean, so ideally it would be, so right now we have a pretty good student group working on it. I'm a little concerned about the UTK people, about if they're gonna be working on this next year or not. But the thing that we're missing are the ancient, additional ancient Greek experts on this that are computationally savvy. The field of papyrology, study of ancient Greek manuscripts, as you can guess, is driven by people that are classicists, people working in the classics. And the challenge of that is that they may not have really good computer skills. And, so we have two really unbalanced parts of the team. We have, the papyrologist, James, who's actually pretty solid programmer himself. And then we have the geek team, all the programmers. There's not a lot of other people that are like in the James thing that can really address the computational issues in this field. So if I was going to say there's a weak point in our team, that's what it would be, is having additional Jameses. We'd like to clone him and get some additional copies of James out there.
All right.
Yeah. The other thing is just, the data itself is pretty massive. We have reading in all the images and processing it. It takes a significant amount of time. I think our training times, I'm going to ask Matthew again, training times for like the ResNet is on the order of 8 hours. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I want to say it's 7-8 hours.
Yeah. So, and I should also mention, just to give credit where credit's due, a lot of the results that are presented were done by the students, like almost all of them. I did some of the early work in terms of consensus algorithms, and I've been working with people on this, but I did not write the neural net. That's Matthew, and that's Ben, and some of the other people that are involved in this. So, Gregory, all the stuff that we've been working on, it's been a really good team effort about learning this. And, and I also will say that I am not an expert in terms of writing, code for Keras. I'm just not. So this is something that Matthew had to learn a lot on his own, with me sort of coaching him. So I think we've, it's gone remarkably well. And I'm absolutely shocked that we can actually predict characters as accurately as we can. We're doing about as good or better than the humans, and the errors seem to be mostly, be problems in the data set, where it's a misclassification or misidentification, and understanding that. So that's where we're focusing now.
Hello, Prof. I think this page I'm looking at, page 42, is neural network, right?
It is. Yes.
Yes, because I can see the input, then down to the RUS activation, down to the output. Okay.
Exactly. So yeah, these are the different configurations. So again, this is a pretty nice, this is repeated 4 times, but this is a pretty simple, straightforward CNN that, works pretty well. And, whenever you're doing neural networks, the thing you want to start out with is something that's simple, because there's no reason to just reach for ResNet with thousands of free parameters if you can reduce it to a simpler system. And if your simpler system doesn't work at all, it's possible that a more complex system is not going to be more accurate. So it's always better to start with simple and then move to more complexity. I think one of the mistakes that people make on these is they start with too complicated a layer initially, or too complicated of a design initially, instead of starting with simple and moving outward. So, it's like fitting something, with fourth order polynomial when you should really start out with a line, right? So other questions?
When you say, oh no, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, it's not working well. When you use BLAST to compare your translated text to try to find other Greek text, I'm assuming, did you have to take like some repository of known Greek literature and also transliterate it?
Yes.
To use with BLAST, and where did you find that?
So, boy, I'm trying to remember the name of the project. There's a couple literatures on the ancient Greek that are public domain. So there's a public domain data set. There's also some private data sets that are available that we found. And yeah, we basically just took all the Greek letters and coded them as amino acids and then put them into a database. So this was Alex Williams' thesis project, but we did some initial experiments with it. Hiram Carroll and I basically did this in an afternoon. I collected the data sets and we literally sat down for 2 hours and we got alignments, which was, again, just utterly shocking that it worked at all. But there are still definitely issues, and a lot of the stuff is not in the known Greek literature. So the stuff that we were identifying tended to be things from the New Testament. It was commentaries in the New Testament. So it was some fragment of a New Testament quote was listed, and then it was listed, a line below. So, but a lot of the manuscripts, to first order, when you find an ancient Greek manuscript, it's probably either the Bible or it's the Iliad. Like it's those two. Iliad, Odyssey, and the Bible are the big ones. Finding rare poems and unusual things is more difficult. Just a side thing about the data, one of the things that's really odd about the data is, unlike most other data sets, this stuff doesn't go to public domain at some point. So the Egyptian Exploration Society basically owns the data and has owned it for 100 years. And so, the stuff that's been published is available, and that's our public data set. But there's been so little data that, computer scientists have not been able to experiment with it because it just wasn't available. So I think one of the big contributions of the project is just getting that out there so that other people can work on it. Anything else? So let me just announce for next week. I do not have a speaker for next week yet. I'm going to try and heavily twist some arms and see if I can change that. And I'm looking at all the people that are currently logged in. I'm just saying. So if you have any other questions, I'm going to hang around for a while. Otherwise, I guess any of the students from my class have any questions or any issues on stuff? Cool. I guess we are done. We'll see you all hopefully next week.